Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. It was the first weekend in our new townhouse I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name is Kendra, and this happened about 2 years ago, shortly after my husband, Mark, and I moved into a 3-story townhouse just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. It was one of those typical suburban developments built in the late 90s, where every house looks almost exactly like the one next to it. We were young parents, and our son, Leo, was only 6 months old at the time. The layout of the house was a bit unusual for us. The kitchen and living room were on the 2nd floor, while the master bedroom and the nursery were all the way up on the 3rd floor. It felt private, but it also meant that when you were downstairs, you were pretty far away from the baby. Because of that distance, a baby monitor wasn't just a luxury, it was a total necessity. Mark had been the one to pick it up. He found a cheap, no-name brand on Amazon that didn't even use Wi-Fi. It was an old-school radio frequency model with a small handheld screen and a plastic camera unit for the nursery. Mark was a sales rep and had to travel to Charlotte for a big conference that weekend. He left on a Friday morning, promising to be back by Sunday afternoon. I wasn't usually a nervous person, but being in a new house always makes you a little jumpy. The townhouse was full of those standard 1990s quirks, creaky floorboards, a humming HVAC system, and thin walls that let you hear the muffled sounds of the neighbors' TVs. I spent most of Friday trying to get organized, unpacking boxes, and making the nursery feel more like home. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, I was exhausted. I put Leo down in his crib on the 3rd floor, kissed his forehead, and made my way down to the living room on the 2nd floor. I had the baby monitor sitting on the coffee table next to a glass of water. The screen was grainy and mostly black and white, but I could see the soft rise and fall of Leo's chest. The audio was mostly static, a low-level white noise that I eventually learned to tune out. Around 11:15 p.m., the static on the monitor broke. It wasn't a cry or a movement from Leo. It sounded like a burst of radio interference, which was common enough in these crowded townhouses. I figured one of the neighbors was using a cordless phone or a walkie-talkie that was on the same frequency. I leaned over to turn the volume down a bit, but then I heard a voice. It was faint and garbled, like someone talking through a thick blanket. I froze, listening intently. It sounded like a woman's voice, but I couldn't make out the words. I told myself it was just the people next door. The walls were thin and frequencies overlap all the time. After a few seconds, the sound faded back into the regular static. I blew it off and went back to my book, but about 20 minutes later, at 11:35 p.m., it happened again. This time, the voice was a little clearer. It wasn't just a random conversation. It sounded like someone was humming. It was a slow, rhythmic tune that felt strangely familiar. I felt a chill run down my spine because I realized it was the same lullaby I had sung to Leo just an hour earlier. I sat up straight, clutching the monitor. The screen showed Leo still sleeping soundly, completely motionless. The nursery was dark, lit only by the tiny green power light on the camera. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I thought maybe I was just tired and my brain was playing tricks on me, turning random static into a familiar melody. I decided to head up to bed. I took the monitor with me, walking up the carpeted stairs to the 3rd floor. I checked in on Leo, who was still fast asleep, and then went into my bedroom right across the hall. I set the monitor on my nightstand and tried to get some sleep. I woke up suddenly at 2:44 a.m. The monitor was making a clicking sound, like someone was tapping a fingernail against the microphone. I stared at the screen. The image was still the same, Leo in his crib, the room silent, but the audio was getting weirder. I heard a soft whisper come through the speaker. It said, "Is he still asleep?" My heart nearly stopped. It sounded exactly like my own voice. It had the same inflection and the same tone I used when I talked to Mark. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I grabbed my phone and almost called the police right then, but I stopped myself. I thought about the interference again. What if someone was playing a prank? What if a neighbor had a similar monitor and was somehow picking up my own previous recordings? I stood up and walked into the hallway. The house was dead quiet. I peeked into the nursery. The room was exactly as I had left it. I looked at the camera unit sitting on the dresser. The little green light was steady. I walked over to the crib and looked down at Leo. He didn't move. I felt a little silly for being so scared, but as I turned to leave the room, I whispered, "It's just the monitor." As soon as the words left my mouth, I heard them repeated back to me. But they didn't come from the hallway where I'd left the handheld unit. They came from the camera unit right next to me. "It's just the monitor," the speaker hissed. The voice was mine, but the timing was off. It was about a half-second too late, like a digital echo. I stood frozen in the middle of the nursery, staring at the plastic camera. I grabbed the camera unit and unplugged it from the wall. I expected the sound to stop, but the handheld receiver in my bedroom started blaring static at full volume. I ran back into my room and grabbed it, desperately trying to find the off switch. Before I could turn it off, a voice came through the receiver. It wasn't my voice this time. It was a deep, raspy breathing. It sounded heavy, like someone had just finished running a marathon. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I took Leo out of his crib, waking him up in the process, and locked myself in the master bathroom with him. I stayed there for the rest of the night, sitting on the cold tile floor with the lights on, holding my son close. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the morning, but I didn't sleep a single wink. When the sun finally came up around 7 a.m., I felt a little more confident. Everything looks less scary in the daylight. I went back into the nursery to plug the camera back in. I wanted to see if it would happen again, or if I could figure out what was wrong with the device. I thought maybe there was some kind of storage or memory glitch that was looping my voice. I set the camera back on the dresser and went downstairs to the kitchen to make some coffee. I brought the handheld monitor with me and set it on the counter. The screen flickered to life, showing the nursery. I saw the crib, the changing table, and the window with the white blinds. I noticed something odd, though. On the screen, the nursery door was wide open. I looked up toward the stairs, knowing for a fact that I had shut the nursery door before coming downstairs. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. I watched the image of the nursery carefully. A shadow moved across the floor on the monitor. It was a tall, thin shadow that seemed to stretch from the corner of the room toward the crib. But here's the thing, the nursery was empty. I could see the entire room on the screen. There was no one there to cast a shadow. Then the audio started again. I heard the sound of footsteps on hardwood, but our third floor was entirely carpeted. The sound on the monitor was the distinct clack-clack-clack of shoes on a wooden floor. I realized then that the nursery I was looking at on the screen didn't perfectly match the room I had just been standing in. The wallpaper in the background of the video feed was a pale yellow. Our nursery was painted a light blue. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I wasn't looking at my son's room. I was looking at a different room entirely, but the monitor was still picking up my voice and my movements from earlier. It was like the device was caught between two different places or two different times. I watched the screen as a figure finally stepped into view. It wasn't a person, it looked like a person, but its proportions were all wrong. It was wearing a dress that looked like it was from the 90s, matching the era the house was built. The woman on the screen walked over to the crib, the yellow wallpapered nursery's crib, and looked down. She turned her head toward the camera. She didn't have a face. It was just a smooth, blank surface where her features should have been. Suddenly she spoke. She used my voice again. "He's not in here," she said. The sound didn't just come from the monitor on the counter. I heard it coming from the floor above me. The sound of a woman's voice echoing through the vents of the house, coming from the third floor. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed Leo, my keys, and my purse, and I ran out the front door. I didn't even bother to lock it. I jumped into my car and drove straight to a Starbucks down the road where there were plenty of people. I called Mark, sobbing, trying to explain what had happened. He sounded confused and worried, telling me he'd leave the conference early and head home. He tried to tell me it was probably just a weird technical glitch, or that I was seeing things because of the stress of the move. I waited at that Starbucks for 4 hours until Mark finally arrived. We went back to the house together. I refused to go inside at first, so he went in alone to check things out. He spent 30 minutes walking through every room, checking the closets in the attic. When he came back out, he looked pale. He told me the house was empty, but he had found something in the nursery. He held up the baby monitor camera. It was melted, not just a little bit, but completely charred, as if it had been tossed into a furnace. The plastic was bubbled and black. He told me it wasn't even plugged into the wall when he found it. It was just sitting on the dresser, a hunk of ruined plastic. But the weirdest part was what he found under the crib. He handed me a small, framed photograph he'd found tucked under the baseboard. It was a photo of a woman standing in a nursery with pale yellow wallpaper. She was holding a baby and she was smiling at the camera. The woman in the photo looked nothing like me, but she was wearing the exact same outfit I had been wearing the night before, a gray sweatshirt and black leggings. We didn't stay in that townhouse much longer. We broke our lease and moved into a small apartment on the other side of town a month later. We lost a lot of money on the deposit, but I didn't care. I never bought another baby monitor. Even now, 2 years later, we just leave the doors open so we can hear Leo if he wakes up. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when the house gets too quiet. I think about the voice that sounded just like mine, practicing my words a half-second too late. And I think about that faceless woman in the yellow room. I wonder if she's still there, watching a version of the nursery that doesn't exist anymore, waiting for a baby that isn't hers. The most unsettling part happened about 6 months after we moved. I was looking through old photos on my phone, and I found a video I had taken of Leo the day before Mark went to Charlotte. In the video, Leo is giggling in his crib, but in the background you can see the baby monitor sitting on the dresser. Even though the camera was pointed at the crib, the screen on the monitor shows me. I'm standing in the corner of the room, staring at the camera with a blank expression. wearing a dress I've never owned in my life. Story 2. Back in the summer of 2023 in Tacoma, Washington, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. My life at that time was a blur of fluorescent lights and caffeine. I was a single father to my 5-year-old son, Leo, and our schedule was pretty exhausting. I would finish my shift at 6 a.m., pick him up from my sister's house, and then try to stay awake until his preschool started or find things to do together on my days off. Because I was always so tired, I started taking Leo to the county public library, specifically the children's wing of the main branch in downtown Tacoma. It was a massive, beautiful building, but the children's section felt like a different world. It was bright, filled with primary colors, and had these huge windows that let in the gray, rainy light of the Pacific Northwest. The acoustics in there were strange, too. Even though it was a library, the high ceilings made every little sound echo, from a page turning to a child's whisper. I liked it there because it was safe and quiet. I could sit in one of the oversized armchairs and half doze while Leo played with the wooden blocks or looked through the picture books. The staff knew us by name, and it felt like a little sanctuary from the grit of my night job. But looking back, I realized that the very things that made me feel comfortable, the silence and the isolation of the back corners, were actually the things that made us vulnerable. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon around 2:15 p.m. Leo was sitting at a small circular table near the back of the wing, tucked away behind some tall bookshelves filled with educational DVDs. I was sitting a few feet away, scrolling through my phone, trying to stay awake. Leo was talking softly to himself, which wasn't unusual. He had a big imagination and often narrated what his toy cars were doing. I didn't really pay attention until I heard him say something that made me freeze. He said, "No, my real dad likes the blue one." I looked up from my phone and saw Leo staring at the empty space across the table from him. He was holding up a picture book about trains. There was no one there, just the empty chairs and the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. I asked him who he was talking to, thinking maybe a librarian had walked by. Leo just looked at me with those big innocent eyes and said, "The other dad. He said you prefer the red trains, but I told him you liked the blue ones." I felt a small chill crawl up my spine, but I laughed it off. I figured he had an imaginary friend, and since I was the only male figure in his life, he just gave the friend the title of dad. A few days later, we were back at the library. It was a particularly rainy day, and the children's wing was mostly empty. I was browsing the adult section nearby when I heard Leo laughing. It wasn't his normal playing with toys laugh. It was the kind of giggle he only gave when someone was tickling him or telling a really good joke. I stepped around the corner of the shelf to check on him. Leo was sitting on the floor in the middle of an aisle. He was looking up, his head tilted back as if he were looking at someone standing directly over him. When he saw me, his expression changed instantly to something more neutral. I scanned the aisle, but it was completely empty. There were no other parents or kids in that section. The nearest librarian was all the way at the front desk, at least 50 feet away. I walked over and knelt down beside him. I asked him what was so funny, and he told me that the other dad had just told him a story about the time I fell off the shed. I felt the blood drain from my face. When I was 7 years old, growing up in a small town in Georgia, I had climbed onto the roof of our garden shed and fallen off, breaking my left wrist. It was a specific, painful memory that I had never mentioned to Lee. I had never told my sister about it either, and my parents had passed away years ago. There was no way Leo could have known that detail. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was a weird coincidence or that maybe I'd mentioned it in my sleep while we were napping. I asked Leo what the other dad looked like. He just shrugged and said, "He looks just like you, Daddy, but his skin stays very still." That comment bothered me for the rest of the week. His skin stays very still. I didn't know what a 5-year-old meant by that, and honestly, I was too scared to dig deeper. I started making excuses to avoid the library, but Leo kept begging to go back. He said the other dad had a gift for him and was waiting in the special spot near the window. Against my better judgment, I took him back the following Monday. It was around 4:45 p.m. and the sun was starting to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the library carpet. I decided I wasn't going to let Leo out of my sight for even a second. We sat together at a table, and I watched him like a hawk while he drew in his sketchbook. I noticed Leo was being very meticulous with his drawing. He was using a black crayon, pressing down hard on the paper. After a while, he held it up to show me. He said, "I drew a picture of you and the other dad." My heart dropped into my stomach when I looked at the page. On the left side, there was a stick figure with Dad written over it. It looked normal. But on the right side of the page, he had drawn another figure. This one was much more detailed. It had my face, or at least a version of it. The eyes were huge and perfectly round, and the mouth was stretched into a wide, toothy grin that went from ear to ear. But the most unsettling part was the neck. Leo had drawn it incredibly long and thin, like a piece of gray wire. I asked him why the other dad looked like that. Leo looked at the drawing and then looked toward the rows of bookshelves. He whispered, because that's how he looks when he's hiding behind the books. He has to stretch to see you. I felt a wave of pure, cold terror wash over me. I stood up, grabbed Leo's hand, and started packing our things. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I just needed to get out of there. As we were walking toward the exit, I had to pass by the history section, which was full of tall, dark wooden shelves. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was a flash of flannel, the exact same red and black pattern I was wearing that day. I stopped and turned, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw a figure standing at the end of the aisle. It was a man. He was wearing my boots, my jeans, and my shirt. He was standing perfectly still, his back turned to me. For a split second, I thought I was looking into a mirror that shouldn't be there, but then the figure began to move. It didn't turn around. Instead, it slowly started to lean its head back. It kept leaning and leaning until its head was completely upside down, staring at me from between its own shoulder blades. The face was an exact replica of mine, but it was like a wax mask that had started to melt. The skin was too smooth, too shiny, and the eyes didn't blink. It didn't have a nose, just two small slits in the middle of its face. And that grin, it was exactly like the drawing Leo had made. It didn't say anything. It just watched me with those wide, unmoving eyes. I didn't scream, I couldn't. I just scooped Leo up into my arms and ran. I burst through the library's glass doors and didn't stop until I reached my car in the parking lot. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped them. I buckled Leo into his car seat and peeled out of the parking lot, heading straight for my sister's house. I stayed there for 3 days. I told her someone had tried to follow us, which wasn't technically a lie. I didn't tell her the truth because I knew how insane it sounded. I kept the doors locked and the blinds closed. Every time I looked in the mirror, I felt a surge of nausea, terrified that my own reflection might start leaning back or showing me those rows of needle-like teeth. Eventually, I had to go back to work. Life had to go on. I haven't been back to that library since, and I don't plan to. I started taking Leo to a small park across town instead. For a few weeks, things seemed to return to normal. Leo stopped talking about the other dad, and I started to convince myself that maybe I'd just had a sleep deprivation-induced hallucination. Then last night happened. I was getting ready for my shift at the gas station around 10:30 p.m. I went into Leo's room to kiss him goodbye while my sister watched him. He was fast asleep, or so I thought. As I leaned over to tuck the blanket around his shoulders, he opened his eyes. He didn't look scared, he looked disappointed. He looked at me and whispered, "You're still here." I asked him what he meant, and he sat up, pointing toward the closet in the corner of the room. The door was cracked open just a few inches. Leo said, "The other dad said you were going away tonight. He said he was going to take over so you could finally get some sleep." I slowly turned my head toward the closet. In the darkness of the crack between the door and the frame, I saw something pale. It was a hand gripping the edge of the door. The fingers were too long and the skin was a sickly, translucent gray. But the ring on the finger was an exact match of my wedding band, the one I'd lost at the library 3 weeks ago. I grabbed Leo and ran out of the room, locking the door behind me. I called the police and they arrived within 10 minutes. They searched the entire house, including the closet and the attic. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the shadows. They told me I was probably just stressed and suggested I see a doctor about my night terrors. But I know what I saw, and I know what Leo told me. Ever since that night, I've been staying in a hotel. I'm too afraid to go back to that house, but I'm even more afraid of what might be waiting for me when I eventually do. Because this morning, while I was getting dressed, I looked at Leo's latest drawing in his sketchbook. It wasn't a picture of me, it was a picture of our new hotel room, and in the drawing there were 2 beds. On one bed, Leo was sleeping. On the other bed, there were 2 of me. One was lying down with his eyes closed, and the other was standing over him, holding a pair of scissors. Underneath the drawing in Leo's messy 5-year-old handwriting were the words, "Almost time to swap." I'm sitting in the hotel lobby right now, writing this on my phone. Leo is sitting next to me, coloring quietly. Every few minutes he looks up at me, tilts his head to the side, and smiles. It's a normal smile, but I can't help but notice that he's looking at my neck, almost like he's waiting for it to start stretching. Story 3. This happened during the months I sent my daughter to a local daycare in Mesa. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I moved to Mesa, Arizona about 3 years ago for a job in medical billing. It was a fresh start for me and my 4-year-old daughter, Chloe. Being a single mom in a new city is never easy, especially when you don't have any family nearby to help with childcare. After searching for weeks, I finally found a place called Little Sunshine's Academy. It was a small daycare tucked away in a dusty strip mall, wedged right between a noisy nail salon and a shady-looking payday loan store. The location wasn't exactly picturesque, but the price was right and the interior seemed clean enough. The director, a woman named Mrs. Gable, was always very polite and professional. She had this permanent, frozen smile and wore her hair in a tight, gray bun that looked like it hurt. She told me they had a few openings and that they took security very seriously, which was all I really cared about at the time. For the first few months, everything seemed completely normal. I would drop Chloe off at 7:45 a.m. on my way to the office and pick her up around 5:15 p.m. Chloe didn't complain much, though she was always unusually tired when she got home. I figured she was just playing hard with the other kids, so I didn't think much of it. Around October, the daycare implemented a new policy. Mrs. Gable told all the parents that they were moving back to a manual paper-based tracking system. She claimed it was for the auditors and that the state required physical signatures for every entry and exit. It seemed a bit old-fashioned since most places were going digital, but I didn't mind. There was a heavy, leather-bound ledger on a high counter at the front desk where we had to sign our kids in and out every day. The first time I noticed something weird was a Thursday afternoon. I had taken Chloe out of daycare that previous Tuesday because she had a mild fever and a cough. We stayed home all day, watched cartoons, and she never left my sight. When I went to sign her out on Thursday, I glanced back at the page for Tuesday to see if I needed to mark her as absent for the records. My heart did a strange little skip when I saw the entry for Tuesday. There was a signature in the parent signature column that looked almost exactly like mine. It said Chloe had been dropped off at 8 a.m. and picked up at 5 p.m. sharp. The ink was a dark, ballpoint blue, the same kind of pen I always used. I stared at it for a second, feeling a wave of confusion wash over me. I figured I must have just misread the date or that maybe another parent with a similar name had signed the wrong line. I didn't want to be that annoying mom, so I just let it go. But a week later, it happened again. We had gone to Tucson over the weekend to visit a friend and didn't get back until Monday night. I kept Chloe home that Monday morning because we were both exhausted from the drive. When I dropped her off on Tuesday, I checked the ledger again. Sure enough, there was a signature for Monday. It wasn't just a scribble either. It was my full name, Sofia Delgado, written in my exact handwriting. Even the way I looped the G at the end of my last name was perfectly replicated. I felt a cold chill run down my spine despite the Arizona heat outside. I stood there at the counter, staring at the page for a long time. The lobby was empty except for the faint sound of kids singing a nursery rhyme in the back room. I looked up and saw Mrs. Gable watching me from her small office behind the plexiglass. She didn't say anything, she just gave me that same stiff, wide smile. I quickly signed Chloe in for the day and hurried out to my car. That night I couldn't stop thinking about that ledger. It made no sense. Someone was signing my name, but why? If it was just about the daycare getting state funding for attendance, they could have just checked a box. Why go through the trouble of forging my specific handwriting? I started looking at Chloe differently that evening, wondering if she had mentioned anything strange. I asked her how her day was and if she did anything special. Chloe was sitting on the floor, playing with some wooden blocks I had bought her. She didn't look up when she answered. She told me they played the mirror game during circle time. I asked her what that was, and she said they had to sit very still and pretend to be someone else so the auditors wouldn't know who was who. Her voice was very flat when she said it, almost like she was reciting something she had memorized. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I asked her who the auditors were, but she just shrugged and started stacking her blocks into a perfect circle. Usually she built towers or houses, but this was just a flat, precise ring of blocks on the carpet. A few days later, I decided to test a theory. I told Mrs. Gable that I would be taking Chloe to a specialist in Phoenix on Wednesday and that she wouldn't be in. Mrs. Gable nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. She told me that attendance is very important for the records and reminded me to sign the ledger when we returned on Thursday. On Wednesday, I didn't go to Phoenix. I stayed in Mesa, but I kept Chloe at home. Around 10:30 a.m., I felt a strange urge to drive by the daycare. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I buckled Chloe into her car seat and drove over to the strip mall. I parked a few rows back near the Payday Loan store where I could see the front door of Little Sunshine's Academy. The windows were tinted so I couldn't see much. I sat there for about 20 minutes feeling like a stalker. Just as I was about to leave, the front door opened. Mrs. Gable walked out onto the sidewalk. She wasn't alone. She was holding the hand of a little girl who looked exactly like Chloe from behind. The girl was wearing the same pink denim jacket and white sneakers Chloe had on in the car next to me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I looked back at my daughter, who was fast asleep in her car seat. Then I looked back at the sidewalk. Mrs. Gable led the girl to a black SUV parked at the curb. They got in and the car drove away. I wanted to follow them, but my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't even put the car in gear. I just sat there, gasping for air, while my daughter slept peacefully behind me. I didn't go back to the daycare that week. I called in sick to work and stayed locked in my house. I felt like I was losing my mind. I kept checking the locks and looking out the window, expecting to see that black SUV in my driveway. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that maybe it was just another girl who looked like Chloe. but deep down I knew what I saw. On Friday night, something even weirder happened. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard Chloe talking in her room. I thought she was on her toy phone, so I walked down the hall to check on her. The door was cracked open. Chloe was sitting on her bed, but she wasn't playing. She was staring at the wall and speaking in a very low, rhythmic voice. I listened closely and my blood turned to ice. She was reciting dates and times. Monday, October 12th, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday, October 13th, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. It sounded like she was reading from the daycare ledger. I pushed the door open and asked her what she was doing. She stopped immediately and looked at me. Her eyes looked darker than usual, almost completely black in the dim light. She told me she was practicing for the audit. She said that if we didn't keep the records right, the auditors would have to come to the house to verify our existence. I didn't know what to say. I picked her up and carried her into the living room, keeping all the lights on for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a single wink. The next morning, I decided I was done. I was going to go to the daycare, get Chloe's things, and tell Mrs. Gable we were moving. I didn't care about the deposit or the contract. I just wanted my daughter away from that place. I left Chloe with a neighbor I finally trusted and drove to the strip mall. It was a Saturday, so the daycare should have been closed, but the open sign was glowing in the window. I walked inside and the smell hit me immediately. It didn't smell like crayons or cleaning supplies anymore. It smelled like old paper and something metallic like copper. The lobby was empty, but the ledger was sitting on the counter. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed the book and started flipping through the pages, looking for the most recent entries. What I found made me feel physically sick. The ledger didn't just have Chloe's name in it anymore. It had my name, my address, and my social security number written over and over again on the back pages. There were also photos clipped to the pages. They weren't school photos. They were candid shots of me inside my house. One showed me sleeping on the couch. Another showed me in the kitchen, taken through the window. "It's important to be thorough," a voice said behind me. I jumped and nearly dropped the ledger. Mrs. Gable was standing in the doorway to the back rooms. She wasn't wearing her usual professional outfit. She was wearing a long, dark robe, and her hair was down, hanging thin and wispy around her shoulders. She didn't look like a daycare director anymore. I asked her what she was doing with pictures of me in my house. I told her I was calling the police. Mrs. Gable didn't look scared. She just stepped closer, her frozen smile stretching even wider. She told me that the police wouldn't find anything wrong with a daycare keeping detailed records of their clients. She said they were just making sure the transfer was documented properly. I didn't stay to ask what she meant by transfer. I turned and bolted out the door, leaving the ledger on the counter. I ran to my car and sped back to my apartment. I grabbed Chloe from the neighbor, threw a few bags of clothes into the trunk, and started driving. I didn't even go back inside to pack the rest of our things. I just needed to get out of Mesa. I drove for 6 hours straight, eventually stopping at a motel in a small town in New Mexico. I finally felt like I could breathe again. I sat on the edge of the bed while Chloe watched TV, trying to process everything that had happened. I decided I would call my boss on Monday and tell him I wasn't coming back. I'd figure out the rest later. I went to my bag to get my toothbrush, but my hand hit something hard at the bottom of the tote. I pulled it out and felt my heart stop. It was a small, leather-bound notebook. I didn't remember packing it. I opened the cover and my breath hitched. It was a mini version of the daycare ledger. The first page was dated for that very day, Saturday. In the location column, it had the name of the motel we were currently staying in. In the status column, it said verified. But the part that really terrified me was the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my handwriting, dated for 10:30 p.m. tonight. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. It was only 9:45 p.m. I looked over at Chloe. She was still watching the TV, but she wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the reflection of me in the dark window, her face completely blank. She whispered that the auditors were very happy with my progress and that the paperwork was almost finished. I haven't closed my eyes since then. I'm currently sitting in a gas station parking lot 3 states away, writing this down. Every time I look in my rearview mirror, I feel like I'm seeing someone else's eyes looking back at me. I checked my bag again an hour ago, and there's a new page in the notebook. It's dated for tomorrow morning. It says we've arrived at our final destination, but the location is left blank. I don't know who's signing these pages, but I'm terrified that by the time the last page is filled, there won't be anything left of the real Sofia Delgado.